We are recording the presentation, but the attendees will not appear in the recording, so your name will not show up in the recording, just the slides that we're showing and the audio that we're going to pick up. We've organized this webcast to have 2 trends from each of us. I believe Ellis is going to go first. He'll give you a little bit of background about who he is and where he's coming from, and then present his first trend, and we're going to run through those. We're hoping that we will get some audience participation via the questions tab, and also in responding to our polls. We're going to ask you to give us an idea of how important you think each of these trends are that we're asking about, and we're curious to see what kind of results we have. If we have time at the end of the session, we will take some questions there as well. So again, just go ahead and post your questions into the questions tab or the questions area, and we will keep an eye on them from there. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ellis Pratt of Cherryleaf.
Thank you, Sarah. Hello, everyone. I think there's first off, oh, apologies, I have a dry cough at the moment, so if I do cough during this, apologies for that. I'm trying to keep that to a minimum. I think there might be a slide about myself. Do I need to click on for that, Sarah, or does that move on itself?
You should have it.
Well, I can't see it here, but let me crack on. Just to tell you a little bit about myself, I'm Sales and Marketing Director at Cherryleaf. We're a technical writing company in England. I'm based just at the edge of London, and we do usual technical writing things of writing documentation for people. We also do training. Where we're slightly different from Tony and Sarah's companies is we also do recruitment. My background is sales and marketing, and part of what I have to do is work out why people want to spend money on getting documentation done. And that drives some of the questions and areas that interest me. So let's move on to the first trend that I've got, which is about documentation becoming more of an emotional experience. By that I mean an emotional experience for the user rather than necessarily an emotional experience through all the stresses and strains of it that happen when an author or technical writer has to produce it. Okay, so let's start off by sort of why is this important? What we're seeing in general within businesses and organizations is, particularly within the West, growth in the level of importance on brand loyalty. And with emerging countries coming through, it's becoming a greater challenge to compete just on cost. So, excuse me, what we see is companies like cell phone companies worried about customer churn and how they can keep their customers. And we see brands being successful to the point where people will actually put their logo onto people's bodies as tattoos. And word-of-mouth referrals. Part of this is because information is in many ways no longer scarce but ubiquitous. But it's also a change in the way in which companies interact with their customers. We talk now less about hierarchies and more about communities, less about customers and more about stakeholders. And part of what big companies are trying to do is get their customers or end users to have a greater sense of belonging or protection within their business, within interaction with them. And some argue it's sort of a more female approach than a male approach to doing business. So when you get a burger these days, you don't just get a burger, you get a burger and also the request of have a nice day, or in the UK they say enjoy your meal. And it's a case of getting a positive feeling when you interact with a business. So if businesses are focused on that and want to go in that direction, then really as an element within a business, technical communicators should be looking at how we can also be consistent with that approach and how we can provide a positive feeling towards documentation. And move away from the sort of feeling of failure that sometimes people have when they go to help to get the information that they want. So how can we do this? How can we make documentation more emotional than the sort of dry sense that it is today? Well, it has been in some ways tried before. Now, I'm not really talking about making the text more emotional. I don't think that would necessarily work. Microsoft, when they developed what was called Longhorn or Microsoft Vista, tried to experiment with the help by using journalists and creating a more conversational approach to it. I'm not certain if that necessarily worked. What it's more about is getting the information in the right place, and it's more about the context in which information is provided, so that people get it when they want it and feel positive, and belong to the information more. So it means delivering it through things like support centres where you have knowledge bases or information from support as well as help. It's embedding it within the application, and it's personalising it using things like the semantic web, and enabling people to give feedback and their opinion within content, with the information as well, so that they feel that they've got a say and that the information is something that's personal and relevant to them. We see this in things that Amazon do with the ranking and feedback forms with the user reviews as well. So in part it means involving or getting the user assistance and information embedded from the beginning. And it means planning the whole of the user experience from beginning to end and thinking where might people need help and assistance and where could the user documentation going in. So that means needing flexible ways in which the content can be produced and can be delivered. And that really, in the time that we've got available, is the essence of what I think is meant by making the documentation more emotional than it is today.
Now, hello everybody, it's Tony here. I've just got a question for you, Ellis, or I suppose an opinion, I guess, and that is that I've heard it said a few times that, that the name help should perhaps be changed on help menus because people have a bad opinion of help, and so and that perhaps we've gone past the point of no return, and that help will always have a bad reputation, and therefore we need to change the name to something else. Yeah. So I guess that would suggest that there is some sort of emotional attachment to documentation, but perhaps it's not a particularly positive emotional response. So do you think we can recover the situation and have people think or think fondly of documentation?
Well, I did hear that Microsoft looked for another word to help, again, when they were doing Vista, and that they, from the usability studies they did, they were, there was a sense of failure when people had to go to help, which meant that they were more reluctant. I think the answer is that people's behavior now is often to search via the web, and that they're willing to find information through the search engines. I think if the information is presented or delivered when people search in that way, so more of a search-driven approach than the navigational approach that we've had in the past, I think then it's just viewed as information. It's not viewed as a document, a manual, but just information that's online and out there. And even if people aren't necessarily connected to the web, I can see the information being provided on mobile phones or cell phones, as you call them in the States, and people reading the information that way. We got the slide up now, that's good news. So let's see if there's any questions. Are the slides meant to be changing? Yes, they are. Well,
perhaps. We're having some issues with that on this end, and we're not too sure why. There is another question here. Is the documentation early enough in the user experience to sway users? Don't most users already have an image of the product or company?
I'm trying to understand the question. Sorry, Kai. Let me just read that and see if is the documentation early enough in the user experience to sway users?
I think so, yeah.
Well, yes, I mean, people's opinion and image of a product and company is going to start from the moment they interact or engage with it, from the moment they hear of the company or the brand, that's true. But then from that point on, that image needs, you want them to have a positive image. If they don't start with a positive image, you need to change it. If they've got a positive image or belief from the start, you need to be consistent and keep that going throughout there. I mean, the best way to get business is to have your end users, your customers, evangelizing about your product to other people. And that needs to be all the way through the interactions they have with the services and products that you're providing. Hopefully that answers the question.
Okay, so I think I'm gonna move us on and say a few prayers about slides advancing. To Tony. So if Tony, you want to do a quick intro?
Yep. Okay. Hello, everybody. My name's Tony Self. I'm based in Melbourne in Australia, although tonight or today or this morning I'm speaking to you from Oslo in Norway, where I'm working on a little project. I just arrived yesterday, so I'm partially jet lagged. So it's 7 a.m. my time, but it's in Oslo it's 10 past 11 in the evening. So my background is in technical writing, so I've been a technical writer all of my working life, and I got involved with computer-based training in hypertext in the early days, and started a company, Hyperwrite, to specialize in hypertext systems for technical writers back in 1993. And these days I mainly provide training and consultancy services in the fields of emerging technologies, so and including DITA. My first point today relates to rhetorical writing and whether as a profession we're going to change from the sort of expository writing that we currently work on to more rhetorical or spin style of writing. So let me explain a little. First of all, I've got a bit of an interest in journalism, personal interest mainly because my daughter is currently studying journalism at university. And that's a strange profession to start to enter, because according to all the figures you can possibly look at, journalism is in decline. So in the US last year, 15,000 newspaper jobs were lost. And the number of newspapers that are closing is astronomical. I think in 2009, 143 newspapers stopped publishing a print edition. And so all around it seems to be that we're witnessing the death of reporting or of journalism as a profession. So, but almost parallel to that, there's been a rise in the number of people wanting to be journalists. And I can sort of speak from an Australian perspective here, in that the number of places for journalism students at universities is growing rapidly. And I also teach at Swinburne University in Melbourne, and they've recently introduced a Bachelor of Journalism program. And that means that in Melbourne, my city, which is a city of about 4 million, the number of university journalism graduates will be about 300 per year now. So where are those 300 new journalists going to go if all of the newspapers are retrenching people? And I don't really know, but one idea might be that they'll go into spin. In other words, not reporting facts, but presenting a positive view of a company's progress or a company's products or whatever. And there's some evidence to back that up in that and I found here some figures from the New Zealand government, and in some of their departments, the number of journalists that a government is employing, and so that's in the public service, it has doubled over the past 10 years. So while journalism jobs in newspapers is declining, the number of journalism jobs in government is increasing. And I suspect that in corporates and all forms of organisation, the number of journalists being employed is increasing. And so that's presumably because the companies are now interested in controlling the news cycle, and so they prefer to have journalists writing their own perspective of a particular story and feeding it to an overworked, underpaid newspaper journalist who now has to do the work of 7, and therefore manipulating, I guess, the news flow. And if I could now bring this back to technical communication, I wonder whether our role will also change. If a lot of the I'm having trouble with the word, explanatory text is now written by people working on wikis or on blogs or on other sort of peer-generated content, what are technical writers going to do? So are we going to become editors of blogs and wikis, or are we going to be drawn more into the rhetorical or the marketing style of writing, that is, writing product information and writing glowing reviews of products and working in that sort of area? So I'm not sure that this is going to be the case, but looking at the path of journalism and seeing that's a fairly parallel profession, I wouldn't be surprised if that's the direction the technical writing eventually takes.
So you're suggesting that we're going to move into a scenario where the idea of neutral technical documentation becomes obsolete? Yes,
I believe so. And I was at a conference last week, actually my own company's conference. It was a beauty. And somebody at the conference was making the point about the way people search for documentation content, and that we did an experiment within the session where we called for questions from the audience and then looked up a typical user question on Google, and we found that the question that a normal person might want to get answered is currently not being answered by the official documentation. It's being answered by a peer. And part of the reason for that, and you can see it, is because a lot of typical users will have problems, and generally it's features that are documented rather than problems that are documented. And so peers generate documentation that covers the problems and problem resolution, whereas in organizations they tend to be very feature focused.
So let's take a look at the, oh, sorry, go ahead, Ellis. I am going to go ahead and launch the poll because I forgot to do it for the first trend that we did. So I'm going to launch the poll for those of you that are on the call, and I think Ellis wanted to say something.
Yeah, I agree that there are things we can learn or can pay attention to from the field of journalism that may affect us. I was at a meeting with a group of publishers where they were talking about changes in the marketplace, and a journalist from the FT, and what they were saying was that the fees that journalists get paid they see changing, where they're rather than getting paid per 1,000 words, they're now deals are being done where they're getting paid per clicks or paid per eyeballs or links into particular sites, and that it's moving more from broadcast to sort of narrowcast. They're getting the names of the people that are reading the articles and then following up with services or adverts that they can target. So this whole thing of 50% of advertising is wasted, which 50%, they're sort of moving to journalism and the funding of it by direct mail rather than sort of adverts in that way. So I'm not sure that spin will come into play, but I do agree that it's going to be more conversational between the audience and the journalist, and that the way in which it's valued and assessed is going to change as well.
Okay. Well, let's take a look. I'll give you all about 5 more seconds, and then I'm going to close the poll and take a look at what comes up here.
And I'd like to respond. There's been a few questions about whether the idea of spin is different from traditional marketing, and how is this new form of journalism different from public relations. And I heard, and I was quite shocked by it, on a radio interview of a journalist who's working for the public broadcaster in Australia, and she was describing the typical news cycle now, which is the premier, which is the political leader of a state, or the media minders of the premier, I should say, fax out or SMS out an invitation for journalists to attend the opening of something, and it's usually in a regional location because that's where the marginal votes are, and the journalists are told to arrive at a particular time and they'll be picked up by a bus and taken somewhere. And the whole process is engineered so that the journalists won't have time to critically examine the material or the thing that's being launched, the product that's being sold. And so, for example, they'll go to the opening of a factory, they'll have to sit through all the speeches, they'll go and have the walk around the factory and for the photo opportunities, then there'll be a lunch, and then there'll be a 5-minute doorstop interview by the Premier, so there'll only be a very short time to ask the Premier the questions, and then they'll be bundled back onto the bus and then delivered back to their newspaper or their radio program with about 10 minutes to spare before deadline. And without the opportunity to actually write something, those journalists would prefer to take the press release that's been written by a journalist working for the Premier and just manipulate it, like edit a little bit, change a few words, and then submit it as their own work, because there's just not enough time to do anything else. So that's probably the difference between traditional public relations and this new form of spin, which is actually having your, I suppose, your own pet journalists writing the content and then manipulating the process so that your content gets published by the newspaper under somebody else's name.
And I think you have one more question, Tony, if you want to take that while I sort of get my slides back up and running here.
Okay, so I'm just looking at this question from Paula. Yeah, I guess the question there relates to whether there's always going to be an aspect of spin, and that that you can't be totally product neutral, and so even when you're writing some explanatory text, you're still taking some sort of initial perspective on it. So I suppose that's true, and I guess everybody realizes that different newspapers, for example, will have different political leanings, and that's something that you'll see reflected in the style of the writing and the way things are described. So I suppose that's going to be true. It's not a clear-cut definition that one is expository and the other one is purely rhetorical. So I guess there is some middle ground in there as well.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's move on. Sorry, trying to keep everybody on schedule. My name's Sarah O'Keefe. I am here at Scriptorium Publishing in North Carolina, where most of what we do is consulting around technical documentation processes. So what we're interested in is mostly tools and technologies, but also business processes and that wonderful new phrase of content strategy. The trend that I wanted to address, perhaps unsurprisingly, ties into that. What we're beginning to see is that people are viewing XML not as a feature or a benefit, but as a prerequisite for other things that they want to do. And in fact, some of those other things may actually tie into what Ellis and Tony are talking about. So we don't hear people saying anymore, or as much, I want XML because it saves me money and I can refactor my localization and this, that, and the other thing, or I have cost avoidance in formatting. What we're hearing now is, I need XML because it will enable me to integrate the authored content, the content being created by the technical writers in-house with user-generated content, because it makes it more searchable, because it makes it easier to put metadata on it. So we're sort of evolving from a scenario where XML was considered a feature in and of itself. Hey, we're going to implement XML, to a more nuanced perspective now where XML is considered a foundational element that is required in order to do other things that are important within that organization. So the way I described this was that XML is moving towards becoming not a feature, but in fact a prerequisite for the features that people are in fact looking at. So any comments from the two of you on that?
It's a bit like, I do agree, but also in the back of my mind is something that somebody once said, that Microsoft Word is like the crack cocaine of the office place. That whilst there's always good intentions to have structured content, and it does enable you to do so much, the trouble is, a bit like junk food, you know, it's so easy to slip into bad ways, and just because you've got to get out the door quickly, scribble something down, get it done in Word or some unstructured format, instead of using a good, well-disciplined approach. And that's, I don't know how we're going to get around that problem of, I've just got to get it done, so let's just use Word.
Yeah, we are certainly seeing a distinction being made between high-value content that is worth spending time and money on, and that is worth reviewing carefully and really, you know, paying close attention to, as opposed to quick and dirty. So there are certainly cases that I'm seeing where the content that is considered more important gets more attention than the content. So for example, the official documentation is done the way with the CMS and the XML and the this and that, but the release notes are slammed out the door in Word because they're considered one-offs and they're not expected to have a long shelf life and those types of things. The problem is, of course, that it's often the case that they end up having a longer shelf life than you might have expected. So it is certainly a problem. I'm going to launch the poll that goes along with this and see what the authors, or sorry, the attendees think. But it is clear to me that the people that come to us and say we need XML are much more sophisticated now than they were even 2 or 3 years ago. 2 or 3 years ago, everything was driven by cost avoidance, localization costs, and sort of containing documentation in the very structured box. And now we're seeing much more of this sort of, okay, that's all very well and good, but we want to move forward with this and do some new things with it and do things that we can't do with Word files. Just simply cannot be done. So I think that's kind of an interesting situation that we have here.
I would say, Sarah, that we know.
Coming in.
I was going to say, with regards to the future, a lot of it we just don't know how documentation is going to be and what it's going to be delivered like. And with XML, you do have the capability of being flexible in how the information is delivered.
Yes, and there's a question here. I'm going to actually send this back out because it's an interesting point. But basically, this participant is saying that you know, translation memory, there was a similar kind of thing where if you use software to translate, then you get more consistent, less costly, less reusable, or more consistent, less costly, and more reusable, and therefore it becomes a compelling sort of business case and you won't have any choice but to go forward with it. And I think I agree with that. So okay, let me close the poll. We'll take a look at the results, and then we will go back to Ellis. So
actually, before you do, can I just chip in on the and just a little observation about XML, and that is that if you're doing software documentation, then once you start talking to developers and you mention XML to them, that you're doing your documentation in an XML, then the developer's eyes light up, and all of a sudden you find that you've got an awful lot of common ground that you didn't have before. And so developers tend to be a lot more willing to cooperate with you if you're working in the same environment as them, even if it's something as generic as XML, because it opens up opportunities for technical communicators and developers to work together. For example, a developer might be able to, and be quite happy to write a little routine that will extract out of his or her source code a reference topic in DITA format that, or a shell of a reference topic in DITA format that shows all the controls on a particular screen, or to do some other fancy work that will help you integrate your documentation with the application. So I think that'll be another driver. As well as XML being great in its own right, I think the fact that you'll be able to talk with a program in their own language will also be an advantage.
Yeah, I do think that's helpful as well. Okay, Ellis, what do we have here under our next trend? Support call user documentation relationship.
Let me just see what slide. Oh, right, there it is, yes. So I said I've got a sales and marketing background, and one of the key things when you're setting up a company is something called marketing positioning. And one of the books that everybody reads when they're setting up an IT company in the beginning is a book called Crossing the Chasm. And in that they argue you've always got to have a competitor to compare yourself against. So if you're a tech pubs department and you're trying to position yourself within the business so that you can get your share of the budget, who is your competition? Who do you compare yourself against? And I am of the opinion that the best comparison is between the support department and technical publications. And what is happening is that technology is changing the relationship between, changing things. People are accessing and getting support information in different ways to before, and we're able to measure what technical publications can do, particularly web content, to make more meaningful comparisons with the support department. So let me just talk about those two things in a little bit more detail. First off, the way in which support is changing. The old way was explained to me as sort of the 50-foot guru. You got stuck, and then within 50 feet of any desk is the expert who knew how to do something. If you got stuck, you asked him or her how to do it. If they didn't know the answer, you then went to the 200-foot guru. So you got up from your desk and you went over to the person that advised the 50-foot guru. Then you would answer. Then, if you still didn't have the answer, you'd pick up the phone and call support. And if you couldn't get through to support or it wasn't correct, you'd go to the manual. And that has been the way for many years. Nowadays, people, more often than not, are going to Google first, and they're doing an automated search. They're searching for the answer on the web. If they can't get the answer, then they're going to human search by using instant messaging or text messages, email, Twitter, and asking friends and acquaintances, do they know how to do it? Then they're going to support, and then they're going to the 50-foot guru. Now, where's the manual fit into that? It actually has become at the top. If you're putting your information in as web pages, and that's what's appearing when people search on the web, and actually the user documentation, technical documentation, has gone to the top. And with web documentation, you can measure things. You can use web analytics to see how many people are reading the stuff and get sort of measurements on ROI. So if a management guru or management consultant was to come in to your business, for the first time with web-based content, when they say, well, how many customers, how many users of your content have you got, what do they think of it, what's the ROI, you can answer those. You can give them some meaningful metrics, statistics on that. And so we now have a mechanism for comparing what support does and what technical publications do, and we can now start to see if there's a relationship. If there's less documentation or fewer amounts of pages of documentation, do we get more support calls? If we increase the amount of documentation, does it affect the amount of people that phone the hotline? And where people have introduced documentation into support centers and online, midway through a release, so it's not something where you can say, oh, it's a new release, but within an existing product, there is evidence that people are seeing a reduction in the amount of support calls by doing that. And what we can also look at is whether there's some sort of balance or self-regulation going on, that if there's less documentation around, do we see more content coming from users? And we can start looking to see whether we can create spreadsheets to do a cost-benefit. Is it worth putting more money into support or more money into documentation? And by knowing that, and we can then make sure that we are more efficient and what the most cost-effective way, and go to the people with the budgets and say, look, if you spend your money with us, you'll actually get a better ROI than what's happened before. And the other aspect that's happening and changing with the relationship between support and, say, documentation is this idea that there's this new generation of digital natives or millennials or Generation Y, people have been brought up on the web. If you look at the behavior that they are manifesting, there was an article in the New York Times a week before where they're saying that teenagers no longer sit on the phone or in the evenings chatting away to their friends like they used to in maybe the 70s and 80s and earlier than that. What they now do is they communicate by text. They use instant messaging, they use SMS to communicate. So there's a change. They're now preferring text-based information over phone calls. So if we can understand the best way of delivering to that generation and provide user documentation to the channels that they use, so instant messaging or SMS or whatever, or to Twitter, then again we are more relevant and more effective channel than the traditional ways of providing support. And when it comes to providing information for instant messaging or texting, as it's text-based, probably technical authors are better at doing that than support call people. And so for that reason, I would argue that the relationship between documentation support is changing, and that we can start to make more effective comparisons as to where money should be spent between the two departments. And that's the essence of my argument in that with this particular subject.
And I think that this is an absolutely sort of terrifying slide, because the implication of this is that if the documentation is not in fact effective, it will become visible that it's not effective, and then we will, not have jobs. I was on the phone with somebody yesterday who was talking about the idea of, and this was a, we'll just leave it at that. We were on the phone with somebody, and they were talking about the idea of outsourcing their content development process to a content factory who would, crank out the content very quickly and maybe slam some metadata on it. And this organization has, some really difficult content challenges. They're regulated. They've got all sorts of issues. And, there's a lot of room for improvement there, and I don't think that particular strategy that they were pursuing, which was essentially get it done as fast and as cheaply as possible, was necessarily the appropriate one for them.
There's let me chip in there before Tony speaks then. Following on from what you said, Sarah, there's Peter Drucker, management guru, died last year, I think it was. He said one of the most important things he said was you can't manage what you can't measure. And one of the difficulties with tech pubs has been is that management haven't known really what its effectiveness has been. When people come to us and they want a manual done or online help done, and you say, well, what budget have you got? They haven't really got any idea of what budget to set or what value they're going to get from the documentation. And this is one of the problems, that people really don't know how much money to put in or spend in documentation, and it's seen as a cost. It's seen as a grudge purchase, and it's, well, let's do it for the cheapest price, because we really don't know what we get. Some value from it, but we don't know quite how much value we actually get.
I'd like to just chip in to, and this, I noticed there was a question from Kai about shouldn't we, or suggesting that we should make documentation into a corporate asset instead of a cost center. And I think when comparing technical support to documentation, technical support have already done that in a lot of companies where if you do ring up tech support, you have to pay money to access the technical support people. And so they've effectively changed from being a cost center, because tech support used to be free, and turned it into a profit center for the organization. And that does upset the equation a bit, because that sort of means that if there's poor documentation and the customer can't make out how to perform a particular function, then they'll pay the company money to contact technical support to do it for them. So yeah, I think that's a funny part of the relationship.
Well, let me also, one thing that companies are very keen on is attention and eyeballs of their customers, and they want an SEO. They want to be high in the Google rankings. And what Google loves is information-rich content. So documentation as an asset, one of the key values that it has nowadays is in boosting the page rankings, the website rankings of a particular site. And Linda Irvin's just put a comment up about user documentation, people are looking at problems and they're provided by other users. What, not documentation? Why aren't documentation people sleuthing out the problems and proactively writing about them? I think it's about this idea of nature abhorring a vacuum. If there's no budget and no time to write the documentation, then the users are sort of filling in the gap. So I think it's part of it may be that people use tech support, technical authors aren't understanding the subject matter and knowing what people want. That may be true. I don't think it is. I think it's more that there's just not the resource to write the content, and that it's users filling in those gaps. That's my view anyway, Linda.
Yeah, and it looks as though, Ellis, based on the poll, the people on this call at least do agree with you that this is a pretty significant problem. So, all right, let's take a look at the next one here, which is Tony. And I'm trying to remember what you had. Oh, yes, my personal favorite.
Okay. Just waiting for that slide to come up. There we go. The automatic generated content. Now, I'm just going to say, and I'm risking here reinforcing some stereotypes about Australia, but there's a revered organisation in Australia called CSIRO. The Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organisation. And one of the things they're most famous for is biologically controlling something called the prickly pear. Australia, sadly, has got a sad history of Europeans introducing pests or introducing animals or plants that for stupid reasons, and then they end up being a pest. For example, Australia has problems with feral rabbits and feral foxes and feral goats and feral camels and feral cats and feral dogs and even feral horses. And we've got there's a word in Australian English called a brumby, and a brumby is the word for a feral horse. And the CSIRO, actually that was just as a preamble to talk about CSIRO. There's a woman at CSIRO called Cecile Paris, and she's been working for a number of years on ways to automatically generate manuals. And back in 2003, she published a paper on the subject, and they released some experimental software. And the aim of the 2003 project was to automate part of the process of generating manuals. So happily, she did say we don't aim to replace writers. Technical writing is a complex task best done by humans. But she said, but generating instruction sets that are tightly linked to product functionality is one component of technical writing that can be tedious and sometimes error-prone. So she was looking at ways of automating some of the documentation process by propagating parts of the manual automatically. And so what they would do instead is create feature sets or task models and then turn the task model into a procedure. And in some cases, some of the way it was done was they just get a person to perform a task using the software, and then in the background her software would be generating the procedures. And one of the papers she published did some usability studies of automatically generated documentation to support Microsoft Word versus a technical writer generated documentation to support Microsoft Word. And she found that in terms of helping the user accomplish a task, then the automatically generated document was just as effective as the technical writer generated content. And so that was obviously a little bit terrifying. And Cecile Paris has continued to do study into this area and into other related areas to do with generation of web content as well. And I noticed recently that she's published a paper called Improving Grammaticality Statistical Sentence Generation, Introducing a Dependency Spanning Free Algorithm with an Argument Satisfaction Model. Anyway, so a lot of what she's doing is incredibly complicated. But I did wonder whether this idea of automatically generating particularly task information might be something that eventually does catch on and become some sort of organizational manager's killer application, and whether a previous discussion about XML playing a role in automatically generating some parts of a document will also, or that XML will become an enabler in this process as well. So I guess my view is that I think that the automatic generation of some parts of the documentation is going to be inevitable. Mike Hughes made an observation at some point that manuals shouldn't really contain task information anyway, because the how to perform a task using a software should be the job of the user interface, not the job of the user assistants. So maybe it fits in with that trend as well too, that yes, maybe if there is automatically generated documents, then it won't be the sort of describing concepts, which will be at the core of future documentation. Maybe it'll be at the periphery, where you're where it's an adjunct, I suppose, to the software specifications, or to the task modeling, or to some aspects of design.
Yeah, I would. Unfortunately, we had a discussion before this webcast began about how we were supposed to disagree with each other, but I don't think there's any question that certain kinds of documentation have been and will continue to be commoditized, and it, you know, as a career development piece of advice, it makes an awful lot of sense to pay attention to the kinds of things that cannot be commoditized. So when you discover that it's not that difficult to do vanilla task documentation in an automatic way, that implies that I should probably be writing more conceptual content so that I can't be commoditized away. And there were a couple of comments in the questions along those general lines. Also, I just want to point out that there are bonus points to the, and Tony, you don't count, there are bonus points to the first person who tells me what that picture is via the questions tab. And if I don't get an answer, I'll tell you what it is. I did want to launch the poll that goes along with the, oh, Walter Hoenig wins.
Yes.
Yes, he does. Yes, this is in fact an Enigma machine from World War II. So this was a code, one of the early encryption devices that, and you know, there's a lot of interesting stories around Enigma. Anyway, sorry, that was an aside. I do want to launch the auto-generated documentation poll. And
well, let me take
a look at that.
Let me take a slightly contrary position, Tony, and ask the question, is it going to be a bit like Google Translate, in that you can translate text automatically into a different language and you get the sense, but sometimes it can go catastrophically wrong?
It could well do, but the Cecile Paris's studies, or her work, seems to show that, I'm just quoting here, we're able to show people were as effective at a task given our text. In some cases, with really complex tasks, the automatically generated text was more effective. So I guess both methods have their risks. So I've read human-generated content that leads me up the wrong path. So it's also likely that some computer-generated text might also go the way of Google Translate and provide some very amusing anecdotes for people. But I think in general, I think that automatically generated task documents are likely to be quite reliable.
I see a lot of overlap with this, and let's see, I'm up to 90%. Lots of people voting on this one. I see a lot of overlap between this and the discussion of machine translation. And there's an awful lot of, oh, it can't be done, it'll never happen kinds of stuff. But we see machine translation being used in a lot of scenarios where it's considered to be good enough. And I think that we're going to see something very similar here, that people will decide that, you know, this is, in fact, it's not necessarily great, even if you make the argument that the handcrafted stuff is of higher quality, that perhaps you can get to a point where the auto-generated stuff in certain kinds of scenarios is good enough. And I don't know that that makes me very happy, but you know, automation seems to be the way everything is going. So I don't know if we can. I don't know that we can necessarily win that argument.
It's the 80-20 rule, isn't it? And technical authors, technical writers tend to hate things being imperfect. They are of a type of personality where they like things to be 100% perfect. And if you're talking about stuff where it's the safety issues, then sometimes they're right, because if there is 20% of a time when people get it wrong, that can have consequences.
Well, and certainly I think you would see a more attention paid to documentation that has implications for, life. So again, medical devices, those kinds of things tend to be more, more of concern, and of course more regulated than something like, how do I use this desktop publishing application?
Yeah.
If I get the font wrong, it's ugly, but it's not earth-shattering. So, okay. Last but not least, and interestingly enough, we developed these all separately. We did not necessarily go through and look at how they do or do not overlap, but there's actually, I think, a lot of this is driving, in a lot of ways, towards the same direction. So my final trend has to do with content curation. This is the idea that as a technical communicator, technical writer, whatever that title is, that one of my responsibilities is going to become evaluating content that is created by other people, such as on blogs and forums and wikis, and making some decisions about what should be promoted, what should be featured, what needs to be corrected, what needs to be buried because it's incorrect or wrong or potentially dangerous. And I see the technical communicator role evolving very much from a mostly writing kind of role into a lots of research and lots of looking at things that other people have written and making some decisions about, for example, what to feature. Here's a featured post on the forum. Or looking at things like, and somebody mentioned this, I think, in the comments earlier, looking at web analytics and the question of, well, what topics are people searching on that they're not finding? And what do we need to do about that? So it becomes a question of evaluating what information needs to be written, what information isn't there, and go down that road. So I think that content curation, or whatever you may call this, is an important kind of feature. The tie-in here is that to the shoes, because we have to mention that, is that in a museum, typically the museum only displays at best 10% of the overall museum collection. So at any given point in time, 90% of the objects, of the artifacts that a museum has, are sitting in storage. And it is the museum curator's job to figure out which 10% tell the story that you want people to understand when they come through your museum and they look at stuff. And so I think we're going to end up in, as technical communicators, with this new and interesting responsibility of managing or perhaps riding herd on the other content sources, other content that's out there, or perhaps looking at the internal private tech support wiki. What kind of information is over there, and what can I harvest over there and put into the documentation? What kinds of questions are they asking there that they're having difficulties with? So that is the last trend that I had. Any comments on that one?
Not necessarily a comment, but just a question. So in your definition of curation, would deletion fit into that as well? Because I have a feeling that having somebody that can choose what to delete is going to be an important skill.
Yes. There is always that question of at what point do you decide that this artifact is no longer relevant and needs to go away. The problem with deletion is that if it's on my corporate forum for which I am a moderator, then I certainly can delete. But if it's, Tony, a blog that you wrote that I don't happen to agree with, I actually can't delete that, right? I can't make it go away. What I can potentially do as the corporate technical communicator type is, I don't want to use the word suppress because it sounds really bad, but I can suppress it. I can choose not to link to it. I can choose to link to other things that I feel as though have more relevance or are more accurate. And there's an interesting question here from Tom about this. How does structured authoring fit into content curation? Will the tech writer curator be converting all of this user-generated content into DITA? And I would say no. I think this user-generated content is going to live out there in the world, and it would be my job as the curator to provide links to it, to highlight things, to perhaps reward user contributors, and to help them, or to help the other users, the other readers, find the most interesting and relevant stuff. And I'm just going to post this comment back, but somebody said, I thought the shoes represented Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz. If we all click our heels together 3 times, we can go home to the days of pre-Web 2.0. I'm afraid, I'm sorry, but I'm afraid not. I had this on the brain because I had just seen Wicked where I was. And another question coming in about highly regulated entities. Yes, that is a really, really good question. You know, what happens to highly regulated entities and their content and user-generated content related to highly regulated entities? And all I can tell you there is that we are already seeing and hearing from people who work in highly regulated environments such as aerospace, and they actually do have user-generated content in the sense that a mechanic might write all over the officially approved documentation the procedure that he feels is better for doing whatever that maintenance thing is. So there is user-generated content happening. It's just not happening in a sort of a wide open Web 2.0 kind of thing. So it's a really, really good question, and I don't have an answer.
Sarah, I think this really plays the strength of technical communicators, and it's interesting to see what Adobe are doing with Adobe Community Help, where they are providing an interface to approved blogs and user-generated content within an AIR help frame. And I can see them opening that up to all authors as a publishable version within RoboHelp. When people talk about technical communicators, or they could do internal communications within the business, I get slightly nervous because that doesn't often happen. But I think with curation, I think it's something that authors would love to do and would be excellent at doing. I think they just need to go out there and start owning it before somebody else comes in and claims it as part of their job role.
Yeah, I think it's an important point. I don't have all the answers. I just see it evolving in this direction. And then I think this, in a lot of ways, ties into some of the other trends that we've all been talking about, that they're not all unrelated. That, for example, the support versus tech doc versus blogs, wikis, and forums, and then it ties back to this question of content curation. I don't think there's any question that we're going to be asked to do this or need to be involved in it because, again, if we go back to the buzzword of the year, this sort of idea of overall content strategy, this clearly needs to be part of it, not just what content am I writing, because we don't write in a vacuum anymore. We don't have that privileged position of being the only people who can reach our end users, which was never entirely the case. But before all this user-generated stuff came along, it was easier for a technical writer to a certain extent, control the message, or for a large corporation to control the message, and I think that power is really being removed. Okay. Did you guys have any other comments on this one? I'm going to close this poll in a second.
No.
I had nothing more to say because I agree. Sorry.
Oh, that's
And I did think the Jews related to the Wizard of Oz as well. I had the same thought.
I had the Wizard of Oz on the brain.
Melissa.
Okay. A couple of notes. Oh, I'll post up the poll if I can get over there without breaking anything. So it looks like this one. Can everybody see that? Okay. All right. So a couple of final notes here, and we will go ahead. If you have other questions that you wanted to post, go ahead and push those into the questions pane, and I'll try and take a look at those. We will put the recording up at that URL. You also might take a look out for upcoming events. In particular, we just added an event with Tristan Bishop, who's going to be doing a session on knowledge integration, which really ties very nicely into some of the things we've been talking about here, so you might want to keep an eye out for that one. And I'm going to put up our contact information slide, and then I'm going to wander over here to the control panel and see what I can find in the questions tab to have people ask about. So one question, which I'll let one of you guys answer. Do you see this role, presumably content curation, also including a company going to a document management system and evaluating what should be kept?
No, I don't, June, because some of that content will be coming from users and out of the control of a document management system, and therefore I think there'll be ways of syndicating or aggregating content, but I don't think it can be managed because a lot of it will be written and residing elsewhere.
Although there could be a gap in the market for some alternative form of document management system or information management system that does allow you to do that aggregation and management and tracking of what people are writing about your product and how you direct people to that content.
Yes, Adobe Community Help does seem to be one thing that Adobe are up to in that sort of way, and yes.
Yeah. So I've got at least one more question, it looks like, here, and then we'll wrap up. So, and this is looks like from Tom Johnson. Oh, and there comes more. Okay. So Tom's question has to do with web platforms, that they continue to move forward with innovative technology, faceted search classifications, all sorts of other cool stuff. In contrast, tech writers using tools that are years behind this level of innovation. Search feature in most apps works about the same as it did 15 years ago. No comments, no RSS feeds, no jQueries. So the question is, will tech writers abandon the hot vendors and move to the latest web tools to keep up with trends and stay competitive? I'll be curious to see what you two think. My answer to this is that part of the move towards XML actually has to do with this, because once I have XML, I can render it out in whatever way I want, and I can support commenting and RSS and all the rest of it. So I have a much more flexible kind of tool to work with, or technology, I should say. The downside to that is, of course, that I have to actually build that. There's not an obvious way to take XML and just magically apply an RSS feed and get all of that up and running. So it can be done, again, with XML as a foundation, and that's basically one of the trends that I'm seeing, is that people are moving to XML in order to enable features that they can't get any other way. So my answer to that would be that people are moving out of the traditional help authoring tools and into XML to accomplish exactly what you're asking about. What do you two think?
Well, I suspect that one of the features that have sort of held the help authoring tool vendor market together has been the fact that help authoring tools are distinctive in that they offer a table of contents feature, and so that's sort of, I suppose, been keeping that help authoring tool market alive. Now, with the advent of Google and with more recently mobile devices, the role of the table of contents is diminishing, and so therefore the attraction of using a help authoring tool is going to drop off. So I do agree with Tom's comment there that nothing has really changed since the mid-1990s, and so I think if help authoring tools probably need to find their place in a new world that doesn't necessarily use a table of contents, and that needs to provide these Web 2.0 features and particularly these new and emerging ideas such as facets. So yes, I totally agree with Tom.
In defence of, it depends on what you mean by help authoring tool, of course. I mean, tools, some of the tools are based on XML or XHTML, and you can put in elements of to get feedback and drop in code. Things like Author and Flare can do that sort of thing. In some ways, they're HTML or web editing tools that are good at large document sets, and you can produce paper content. Obviously, you can do a lot more with an XML-based approach, but then you've got a different scale of cost involved with it. So I think they've been held back by having to wait or waiting for Microsoft to tell them what the new standard is. I think now that's gone out the window, and Microsoft doesn't set the rules. And now what people are doing is creating web pages that can be concatenated or published as paper content. So, you know, things like Flare and Author have moved on in recent years and can do some fairly decent things. So I agree, but you know, there's still a place within small document sets and with people without huge budgets to use a tool like Author or Flare.
Mm-hmm. And there was an interesting comment here from Larry. I think I'm going to give him the last word. I forwarded it out via the questions tab, but basically that perhaps marketing is moving towards being less persuasive and more factual, and it would be ironic if we then are suddenly moving in the other direction.
Well, I think what it's about, Larry, is trust. That people are more skeptical, and they want to go with trusted brands. And a lot of what companies are doing is trying to build trust with their customers and their potential customers. And part of that is being credible, and part of it is being persuasive. So in some situations, if they're not credible, they will need to be more credible to be trustworthy. In other situations, to be trusted, they'll need to be more persuasive. So it depends on what starting point you're at as to which direction you need to go in. I think in general it needs to be more, it needs to be nurturing, trustworthy, protective, and that you don't necessarily get from just the facts. It needs to be a little bit more, particularly the context in which it's delivered.
Okay, and with that, I think we're going to close this out. Thank you all for coming, and if you have additional questions, you can find all of us via our various websites. Ellis and I are also on Twitter. I believe, Tony, that you're on Twitter, but perhaps not very actively.
That's right, very unactively.
Very unactively, but we are findable, and we would love to hear from all of you. And I will also just put in a plug for the upcoming events. We do have one or two coming up every month between now and, you know, June, July, August. So hopefully you'll find more of these, and we'll find them informative. And thank you very much to Ellis and Tony for staying up at a, you know, sort of late hour for you all to make this work across all the various time zones that we are dealing with. And I look forward to seeing you guys at some point soon.
Well, thank you, Sarah, and thank you for the questions and the feedback from all the people listening in as well.
Yes, there were lots of great questions, and I appreciate that. I know they're a pain to type.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for the discussion.
So thank you, everybody, and we'll see you soon.